listening to my favorite talk show, The Weekly Show with Other.
This is episode 178 on the 6th of March 2020. Being a Friday evening, there are a lot of discussions on the menu tonight. From the MCD allowing open air restaurants in the southern part of Delhi, the Women's World T20 Championship final between India and Australia. Will also be a discussion on the new selection committee as well as the damaging statements by a few experts on the current Indian players. So stay tuned for an engrossing Friday evening talk show. Welcome to part 1 of this episode. You can soon dine in the open in South Delhi eateries. Those who have been to European cities know that there are open air restaurants on the pavements where people can sit outside the same restaurant and enjoy the nature and the view of the city. And if the MCD's plan goes through, this may be a reality in Delhi. It's not going to be the same experience because the MCD has a few restrictive clause. In Europe, these restaurants are stationed on pavements which are public pavements. But the MCD says that the public pavements in India cannot be encroached. The pavements or the land has to be owned by the restaurant privately and they cannot encroach on the land owned by the public authorities. But my question is, where are the pavements? Pavements do not exist in Delhi. Pavements are either misused by vendors or occupied by malba and debris or cars which have been standing there for so long that they may belong to the 14th century. The only way the restaurant will be able to utilize its space is if the MCD allows it, reopens the restrictions on the roof. That is the only place the restaurant privately owns. At best, this idea of an open air restaurant can be mirrored in a place which mirrors the architecture style of the restaurants and the buildings in Europe. No other part of Delhi has that much space to allow for open air restaurants. Quite perplexing when the MCD says privately owned space of the eatery or the restaurant. The restaurant decides to expand its space. It will obviously have to encroach on public land. It means that public land will become the privately owned space of the restaurant. So this notification by the MCD is quite perplexing if there are so many restrictions. While it's a new gesture by the MCDs to allow for such open air restaurants, the strange restrictions imposed may not allow for this idea to flourish for a long time. Then comes the issue of pollution. If the open air restaurants eventually become a reality in Delhi, have to be eventually on the roadsides. And looking at the inimical nature of the pollution in the city, will it be safe enough for the city dwellers to eat outside? This may work in winters. It will be an antithesis if this idea has to be taken forward to the summers. Nobody wants to sit in a 40-degree heat outside the restaurant. They rather sit inside the restaurant under the AC. The question is, while the MCD has come forward with this proposal, will the other agencies also agree to this? Will the fire department and the police department also agree to such a proposal? The federal agencies will have to be brought on the same book. If the city council approves, will the police and the fire department and other allied department agree to such a proposal, or will they have their own objections? Especially when it comes to barbecue and such kind of open air cooking, quite surprisingly are not being allowed, then the whole idea of an open air restaurant and its fantasy is lost if there are so many restrictions and one needs so many NOCs from multiple federal agencies. A city which jostles for the most basic space like housing and parking. Restaurants expanding their business may or may not work for the city dwellers. Still, if you look at it, it's an interesting proposal, but the restrictions need to be reduced if we have to go further into having such open air restaurants becoming a reality. But at this point, the only way the restaurants can become a reality is if the federal agencies like the police, the fire department, the various MCDs and other allied city council departments allow reopening of the restaurant, which can be allowed on their roofs, which is the only practical way to have an open air restaurant looking at the numerous restrictions imposed by these agencies. Let us look at the restriction in more detail. The draft makes it clear that neither live band performances nor loud music will be allowed. Only light music like mellow jazz or ghazal can be played in the background. Regulations prohibit noise levels to be higher than 45 to 55 decibels in the residential areas. While one can understand the municipal corporation's restriction on the noise level because of the restaurant's proximity to the residential areas, at least live band should be allowed. Otherwise, this whole exercise will be just another excuse for the various municipal corporations to earn revenues in the most unorthodox methods. The question is, why are the MCDs charging for this open air expansion if the restaurant's private space can only be occupied? And if the public pavements and public land cannot be encroached upon, then what is the need for this high sensing fees around 100 rupees per square foot? It just doesn't feel right the way these MCDs are approaching this proposal. This ends part 1 of this episode. Stay tuned for part 2. Welcome to part 2 of this episode. Having reached the main event of the World T20 Women's Championship in the most dramatic fashion, the Indian women's team are now one step away from winning their first ever women's title. Their opponents are Australia, who are looking for their first ever home title as well as their 5th World Championship title. Often doesn't happen that two teams who meet in the same group also go on to meet in the final of a World Cup. This has happened rarely. It happened in the 2003 World Cup. India and Australia met in the group stages, then went on to meet each other in the finals. There, Australia had the wood over India as Australia beat India twice. It happened again in the 2015 Men's 50 over World Cup when Australia and New Zealand met in the stages where New Zealand eclipsed Australia by 1 wicket, but Australia fought back and won the World Championship, the 50 over World Championship. So at this point, while people may say that India are the favorites, at this point it is an unknown factor. India have been to the main event 6 times, been there, done that, while for the Indian team it is their first ever main event in any World Championship. For the Indian team, it won't be their skills in terms of playing the sport, but the psychological aspects of the sport which will put them in a doubt that whether they can win the championship or not, or the numerous messages they will receive by their male counterparts and their male and female counterparts in other sports. According to me, such messages should not be sent without a reason. What do we achieve by sending such messages which say that yes, you can do it, all the best, the World Cup is yours, the women's team has shown what the women's sport can do, any other unnecessary messages? The media manager of the team should make sure that until the match begins, the women's team is immune to such messages because it can put them off their game. Yes, this might be the first time a full-blooded women's team and not of a singles competition but of a team game has entered their first ever finals. Such messages are no more than a distraction. As a media manager and a coach, I would tell them to concentrate on the game and not be affected by the good luck messages and go and play the sport irrespective of the results. The irony of playing on 8th March, which coincidentally becomes Women's Day, should not be lost on them, and such external factors should not influence the way they play the sport. Also has to understand that while Australia may be the defending champion, there is no champion's advantage here. Unlike the men's division, the women's division and this game has a completely different DNA to how it functions and how this sport is played. There is this almost apologetic attitude towards the women's players as if we pity them all the time because they are not as muscular as their male counterparts, so they need the boundary line to be brought in. Commentators also go on this unnecessary rhetoric of not being too critical about the players, perplexing the way we treat the women cricket players despite all the talk about women empowerment and the feminist attitude in the 21st century. Cricket is the only sport in which the dimensions of a men's and women's game are different. As different as chalk and cheese. Here is an interesting example. Women's matches generally do not have the DRS. They are not attuned to the DRS, but for this tournament, the DRS was specially introduced, and one could see that the lack of experience of using the DRS cost most of the teams. They didn't know whether to use this DRS, when to use it, how to use it, if there was any kind of experience behind. They had none. And it almost seemed obligatory for the ICC to suddenly thrust upon this DRS upon them. That's because a world championship tournament requires the use of DRS. Once this championship is over and the teams go back to playing bilateral series, the respective board will not want to spend one penny on the DRS. So until the next world tournament, these players be deprived of the necessary practice to use this umpire referral system. This kind of attitude is absolutely rubbish. Back to this main event as to who can win this main event. As I said, Australia may be the defending champions, but there is no champion's advantage here. Yes, there is the prospect of winning a world title at home, which no team wants to let go. Till this point of time, both the teams are equally capable of winning the world title, and the weakness that they possess not significant enough for either of these teams to be deprived of a chance to win another world title or for India to win its first ever team game world title as far as the women's sport is concerned. This ends part 2 of this episode. Stay tuned for part 3. is a new selection committee for the men's division of the sport called cricket. And who are they? Everybody knows who these individuals are. Who is Sunil Joshi? Who is Venkatesh Prasad? At best, they would always be known as fringe players. Replace another weak selection committee which was led by another fringe individual called MSK Prasad, whose contribution to the sport was 0.00001%. Cricket Advisory Committee who chose the selectors themselves are not of any pedigree. So yes, the weak would always choose the weak. Madan Lal, R.P. Singh and another player whose name I do not remember formed the recruitment panel who were chosen to select the selection committee. Weak always begets the weak. Can one call playing 15 test matches and experience? Look at the names which were there before this new selection committee was formed. MSK Prasad, Gagan Khoda, Jatin Paranjpi, Sarandeep Singh and Devang Gandhi. Their selection is ironical. How can these individuals select future players when they themselves were dropped from the team because of their non-performance and because they were considered a liability to the team, and now they are getting the job, the very job which discarded them when they were players? For me, such individuals do not have the far-sightedness to select a proper team. Even if these individuals have been selected, according to me, they must undergo a compulsory 2-week selectors training program so that they can do their job without bias. Joshi, who has been selected as the chairperson of the selectors, the reasoning behind it being that he can take head-on a hot-headed person like Virat Kohli, because Sunil Joshi purposely has the attitude to take on such players because of his superior communication skills. Individuals are only selected because they are malleable and they can be bullied as per the whims and fancies and the needs of the cricket board and the cricket board chairperson. It's a case of handing out experienced individuals as the selectors, then I would give it to someone like Virender Sehwag and Zahir Khan, who are far more superior in skills and experience than these fringe players. These individuals evaluating the performance of the current players and selecting them or dropping them is very much like a fifth class student evaluating the performance of a student with a master's degree. Yes, analogy may not be as accurate, but this is the closest one can think of such a situation. It would be surprising if for the South African series these individuals pick up Shikhar Dhawan, because Dhawan is another fringe player like them who has been lucky enough to play over 150 matches. Birds of the same feather flock together. Don't be surprised if they drop Prithvi Shaw from the team because he did not perform well. Let me tell you, Prithvi Shaw is more talented than the likes of MSK Prasad and Jatin Paranjpai, Gagan Khoda, Devang Gandhi put together. It would be an insult to compare the likes of Prithvi Shaw, Mayank Agarwal to the likes of Devang Gandhi, MSK Prasad and the batters in the selection committee. No way can these two groups be compared because Prithvi Shaw and Shubman Gill are much more skilled in every aspect, and if they are dropped, it would be a huge mistake. Since only 15 players can be selected and most likely with both Rohit Sharma and Shikhar Dhawan returning from injuries, they will have to by default drop Prithvi Shaw, Mayank Agarwal and Shubman Gill from the team. It will be a travesty if this happens. So don't be surprised if a section of incompetent pseudo-expert support this selection committee. Justify the term birds of a feather flock together. So incompetent experts will support incompetent selection committee. This ends part 3 of the episode. Stay tuned for part 4. Welcome to part 4 of this episode. The defamatory comments by a so-called legend in Kapil Dev against the current captain Virat Kohli not pardonable. In fact, he should apologize for his comments, which are damaging to the reputation of a legend in Kohli. It is understood that Kapil Dev was disappointed by the performance showed by the Indian team as a whole and Virat Kohli as an individual in the recently concluded New Zealand Championship. Have voiced his disappointment in a more mature manner, and it is unbecoming of someone who has been called a legend. Kapil Dev feels slowing down of reflexes could be the reason behind Virat Kohli's struggle in New Zealand, and the Indian skipper needs to practice more to overcome the age factor. Individual further goes on to say that I think Kohli needs to adjust his eyesight a bit when big players start getting bold or LBW to incoming deliveries. Then you have to tell them to practice more. Virat Kohli will practice more or not. That's up to Virat Kohli.